So what happens when a job ends in Ontario? Well, the difference between walking away with a couple months' pay versus a full year's salary can literally come down to a few sentences buried in your employment contract. It is a super high-stakes world where the rules are always changing, and trust me, understanding them can make a massive, massive difference. So here's what we're going to break down. First, we'll look at the two completely different sets of rules for termination pay. Then we'll dive into the legal puzzle that's making most contracts basically useless. After that, a recent case that might change everything, the special rules for big layoffs, and finally, what all of this really means for you, whether you're an employee or an employer. To really get a handle on getting fired in Ontario, you have to understand this one key thing. There isn't just one rule. Nope, there are two totally different systems working at the same time. The best way to think about it is a legal floor and a much, much higher ceiling.
Okay, so on one side, you've got the Employment Standards Act, or the ESA. This is the absolute bare minimum an employer legally has to give you. It's the floor, and nobody can go below it. But then, there's the common law. This is a way more generous standard that's been built up by judges over decades. It looks at things like your age, how long you were with the company, and the type of job you had. This is the ceiling, and frankly, it's where the life-changing money is.
And just to show you how huge this difference is, take a look at this. An employee who's been there for 8 years, under the ESA minimums, they get just 8 weeks of pay. But under the common law, that same person could be looking at 8, 12, maybe even more months of pay. We are not talking about a small gap here. This is the kind of difference that can completely change your financial situation. So this is the million-dollar question. What decides if you get the floor or the ceiling? It all boils down to one single document, your employment contract. If that contract is written perfectly, it can legally limit you to just those minimums. But if it's flawed, even a little bit, the door swings wide open to that much bigger common law payout.
And that brings us to the big problem, the real conundrum here. For years, employers have been trying to write these ironclad contracts, but the courts have just been tearing them up one after the other. It's created this massive cloud of uncertainty and, really, a legal minefield for businesses.
So that raises a really important question. What happens if a contract has a bunch of different parts about termination, and just one little piece of it breaks the rules, even a part that doesn't even apply to your situation?
Well, the answer comes from this landmark case, Wrongful v. Swagon, and it created a super powerful rule. Basically, courts will look at the entire termination section of your contract as one whole piece. If any single part of it is illegal, poof, the whole thing gets tossed out. It's a complete all-or-nothing deal.
And this sets off a kind of domino effect. So let's say an employer has a clause for firing someone for cause that illegally tries to get out of paying ESA minimums. Now, even if you're being let go without cause, that one bad for-cause section infects the whole clause. The entire thing becomes void. And boom, just like that, the employee is now entitled to that much, much bigger common law package.
And believe me, this isn't just a one-off thing. In one case, Rossman v. Canadian Solar, something as simple as confusing wording about when your benefits end was enough to nuke the whole clause. Then more recently, in another case, the court flat out refused to even reconsider the Wachsdale decision, basically cementing it as the law of the land. The trend is crystal clear. If a contract is even a little bit ambiguous, the courts are going to side with the employee. So after years of employers just losing these court battles left and right, a very recent decision from the Ontario Court of Appeal, Birch v. Data Steelth, has really shaken things up. It's given employers what they see as a glimmer of hope, or at the very least, a much clearer roadmap for how to write a termination clause that might actually stick.
Let's actually look at the exact language that the court said was okay. I mean, look how direct this is. It says if you're terminated with or without cause, you will get only the minimum payments under the ESA. And then it says this satisfies any common law rights. There's almost no wiggle room for interpretation there. So why did this one work when so many others failed? Well, the court pointed to 3 big reasons. First, the language was just super clear, no ambiguity. Second, by using that phrase with or without cause, it closed the loophole that created the Wachsdale trap. And third, it had this clever little fail-safe clause. It basically said, hey, if any part of this is somehow illegal, we promise to at least pay the ESA minimums. And that showed the court that the employer was trying to follow the law. Okay, so everything we've talked about so far applies to individual people being let go. But what happens when a company does a huge layoff, letting go of a big group of people all at once? Well, that triggers a completely different and much stricter set of rules known as mass termination provisions.
The magic number you need to remember here is 50. If an employer lets go of 50 or more employees at a single establishment within a 4-week period, the special mass termination rules kick in.
And when those rules are triggered, the amount of notice required gets a lot bigger. Instead of being based on how long you work there, it's now based on how many people are being laid off. As you can see, it starts at 8 weeks and shoots all the way up to 16 weeks for layoffs of 500 or more. For a lot of people, that's way more than they'd get under the normal rules.
Now, for the longest time, the key word here was establishment, which pretty much just meant a physical office or building. But in our new remote work world, that definition created a huge legal gray area. So, naturally, the law had to evolve.
And it did. Thanks to a new law, Bill 79, the definition of establishment has now been officially expanded to include the private home of an employee who works remotely. This is a game changer. It means all those remote workers now count towards that 50-person threshold, and they get the exact same protections and notice periods as everyone else.
And here is a super critical detail that employers mess up all the time. In a mass layoff, that notice clock for the 8, 12, or 16 weeks, it doesn't even start ticking until the company files a special document called a Form 1 with the government. Forgetting that step, or even just delaying it, can be an incredibly expensive mistake.
All right, we have covered a lot of ground. We've got the two-tiered system, the chaos from the Walksdale case, a possible way forward with the Birch decision, and the special rules for mass layoffs. So let's try to pull all this together and figure out what it actually means for you.
So here are the key takeaways. For employers, listen up. If you haven't updated your contract templates in the last couple of years, they are almost certainly unenforceable. You need to review and update them, probably using that Birch case as your guide. Now for employees, never ever just assume the termination clause in your contract is valid. One tiny flaw could be the difference between getting weeks of pay and getting months of pay under the common law. And for everyone, the big lesson is that this area of the law is always moving.
And that leaves us with one final, pretty important thought. The Birch case has given us a clear model for what works, right now. But given the entire history of how courts have handled this, it raises a huge question for everybody. Your contract might be legally solid today, but will it still be solid tomorrow?